It's March the 27th, 2008. My name is Tanya Finchum, and I'm here in the Angie DeBow room on the OSU campus. And my guest today is Penny Williams, and this is part 2 of an oral history with women in the Oklahoma Legislature. And Ms. Williams served for 24 years. And our last discussion, we talked a little bit about education issues, health insurance, and taxes a little bit. And today we're going to continue and discuss some other things she was involved with. So thank you for coming to Stillwater.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Since we're in this room, we can start with Angie DeBow.
Great place to start. I just love being in here with all of these documents brought together into focus in one room, because these were all through her house. Great to see them here. She is someone I am very proud of introducing to Robert Henry, who's now a judge, who's now, a 10th Circuit Court judge. In fact, he is the chief. He presides over the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. At any rate, I think Robert Henry was my ace in the hole. Mm-hmm. Whenever, as a freshman and a sophomore in the legislature, whenever I really wanted to do something I cared about, I would go to Robert Henry because I knew he could help us get it passed. So in that respect, I was kind of an old-fashioned woman in the legislature. And I think that I had great taste. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And immediately when I first learned about Angie DeBow, I thought, this is someone I should have been knowing about long ago. And Robert Henry, of course, thought the same thing when he heard about her. And now he's probably her main spokesperson or publicist. But I thought we had never hung a woman in the Capitol. And I thought it was high time that she should be the first woman to be hung. Because all the paintings in the Capitol that had been commissioned had been, of men. Will Rogers and Carl Albert and Robert Kerr, people you would have, of course. But we didn't have the person who really became nationally, internationally famous as a historian for recording Oklahoma's history as we were transformed into a state. We went from an Indian nation, as we were recognized by the federal government, to a state. At any rate, she did a graduate work at OU and did her undergraduate work at OU, did her graduate work at the University of Chicago. But she really learned how to do research. So she came back to OU and did her graduate work. And she delved into the files of what happened to Indian Territory and what happened to the land, and did her PhD thesis on that subject. And she went into archives that hadn't been delved into by anyone before, and she had a hard time finding them. Finally, in the Creek County courthouse, getting way too back into time. But she found out about the Dawes Commission, and that was at the end of the 19th century and the earlier part of the 20th. All of the breakup of the Indian lands was what doomed them to lose everything, really. When they were bound together as a tribe, they had the land, as they said, the moon, the sun, the stars, and the land that were all shared. Mm-hmm. They didn't believe in ownership, but it wasn't a concept that was natural to them, as you know. At any rate, she just thought this was so curious. And of course, those particular tribes, the 5 civilized tribes, were forced marched to Oklahoma, as many of them were. So it's a very interesting place in terms of its troubled past and people have an ambivalent relationship to our own state. And Robert Henry was so immediately responsive to that. I think he loves Oklahoma and Oklahoma history in much the way Angie did. But he also saw the problems. I mean, truth-telling is a very serious business. When you're going in to do that research and you find something, you find out things that aren't going to be popular, it's hard. Anyway, too long for now. We commissioned a portrait of Angie DeVoe, painted by our court painter, who had Charles Banks Wilson, who had done the frescoes in the state capitol and rotunda there, and other paintings subsequently he did. But we asked him to do her, and he seemed very pleased to be asked. I mean, he didn't really hesitate. And so that was my first experience with pork barrel. That's because Robert Henry had been there, and he knew how. He served on the Appropriations Committee, and he knew how to get a small amount of money tucked into the appropriations bill. So at any rate, that's how we got the money for the portrait, as has happened before in the Capitol with all the other art there. And had a wonderful ceremony. It was the most moving ceremony. So with the tribespeople there who had come to honor her. George and I was governor, and it was just a wonderfully moving ceremony. Then a very interesting thing happened before she died. When Henry Bellman was governor, this was very soon before she died, and she wasn't really able to come to the Capitol anymore. She won the Charles Dunning Prize for History. And this is like the Nobel Prize for History, but it's only given about once every 25 years or so. And this prize was such an honor. No Oklahoman and no woman had ever received this award before. So we had a ceremony at her house, and Henry Bellman traveled down to Marshall, and many of her friends from out of town and in town all crammed into her house, and she got that award. Anyway, it's just such a privilege and pleasure to be here. It was a wonderful friendship. I loved driving up to Marshall to visit with her, and I should say the way I found out about her initially was when I was working for the Equal Rights Amendment. Mm-hmm. And we certainly wanted to get her legislators' vote and other legislators' votes on this when it came up in Oklahoma. She wrote a wonderful letter in support of that. I should bring you that. I should bring you that for this room here.
I don't know if they'd have a copy or not.
I don't know.
It'd be good to have.
Yeah.
Well, was it difficult getting approval for her to be the first woman to be hung?
No.
To be hung?
No.
Wasn't it challenge?
It wasn't difficult. It was just, it was really thanks to Robert Henry's charm and knowledge of how to get things done through the legislature. So it wasn't a very public issue until after we'd gotten it done, because it was in the, in a huge appropriations bill that had all these millions for everything else. This was just a teeny little $35,000 or something, way below the market price for any Charles Banks Wilson work. And we, part of that was really a gift to the state. Right. We came up with some seed money for it. It was just one of those things I look back on, and when I think of my last year in the legislature, let's say, and then look back to those early days, I think we've lost a lot in knowing how to move things through that help grace the state. I think what happened along the way is somehow, and you had asked me this before about biggest change. And it's somehow our relationship to investing in ourselves, tax dollars for services. I think in those days, when we did the little commission to Charles Max Wilson for Angie's portrait, we were just learning about some of the things we had to be proud of, more than we knew. Most of us had never heard of Angie DeVoe and never heard of her honors and her work. And she wrote book reviews for the New York Times weekly for years, and people outside of Oklahoma knew her. She was very famous, but we didn't know her inside. And in those years, we started finding out some things about our state that were just extraordinary. And some gems, world-class gems, that people don't talk about them. We knew about Gilcrease Museum, for instance, but we didn't know about the DeGolyer History of Science collection. There are lots of things we had not known about that started coming to light in those very positive days, even while the economy was going down. We had positive days, and people, not that anybody else was like Robert Henry, but we had people who were discovering their own past and doing things to honor that past and make it more known. And so it's just a great time to be there, even though we were losing money and the price of oil was going down. They say, do you think, no, it would be unthinkable for the price of oil to go up to $25 a barrel? And no one could believe it. I think it did get to 27 in those years, and then it went down, took a big swoop down. And now when you think of 105 a barrel, anyway, it's amazing. So it was a great time to just share in some of the positive discoveries about ourselves and the excellence that we really have had all along in this state and that we needed to build on. So you'd asked me about some other things that I did, more along those lines, building on that excellence we already had.
Well, with Angie DeVoe too, you also helped raise money to do a film.
We did, and that became pretty well known nationally, and that was very little state money, a few $1,000.
Well, just really used your Rolodex to get to solicit.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you for remembering that. That was important, and most people were in the position I'd been in. They didn't know about her. So the film did bring her a lot, make her come alive for students of other generations.
Did you keep a copy of that solicitation letter? That might be interesting to have too.
That's a good idea. Good idea. And I thought you were going to say the film. I certainly have a copy of the film.
I think we may have.
I bet you do.
Well, besides Angie DeVoe, you said you mentioned a little bit of the Artist in Residence. You just were a supporter of that.
Yeah, I didn't create that program. All I did was to get money. This funny thing happened about pork barrel, quote unquote, pork barrel legislation. For some reason, people thought getting money for the arts was my pork barrel. And there were lots of people who wanted money for this highway and that highway and this bridge, and it would get named after them and everything. They just thought if they gave me some money for the arts, I'd be okay. And it was. Angie was one of my very few forays into the personal, getting something personal done. It was, they just sort of assigned me the arts. And so instead of thinking about the arts as our heritage, which of course we now do, and a responsibility to invest in our children's inheritance, we just thought of that as something, she cares about that, we'll give her that this year. And so that's how we funded a number of things in the arts. Because I was told, and Kelly Haney, who could have done those kinds of things, had other things to do. He got a few things done for the arts, but he also had very many other things to do. And so he would always say, she'll take care of that. So anyway, those were funny days. Now we have that at the national level. It's such a huge thing. And so things get labeled pork barrel that are really of national importance, environmental issues and parks and things like that. But there's definitely a distinction. There are things of national importance or state importance, and then there are things that are pet projects. I never thought the arts as a whole should be a pet project, anybody's pet project. It was absurd to have them relegated to that. And I think we have come a long way. We have assumed a lot more pride in who we are and the variety of our people. You and I are both from other states. And we have adopted this state, and it is such a quirky state. And we can just see it. But I could really see this pride growing in those days in the 80s when people started being more proud of who they were. And then I will just say this one other thing about, which I think I mentioned before, but this whole thing about the arts being seen as elitist, that was so absurd. So we shouldn't put any public money in the arts because only rich people went to museums. And that was sort of the thinking. And it was more the thinking at the national level because we had learned to take a lot of pride in the arts we had in Oklahoma. And I have to attribute that totally to Betty Price. She was the most wonderful arts council. She just stepped down this last year, 2007. She's the most fabulous arts director, and people from other states were envious of her for having her. And she really helped make art popular, and our own art popular at the legislature. But at the national level, when they were disinvesting, they wanted to just do away with appropriations for the National Endowment for the Arts and public television and NPR and all of that. OETA would have been defunded. And that's what they tried to do. And I just think it's maybe the difference in being a nation and a country. That in a sense, when we really made this commitment to the arts, both in Oklahoma and nationally, we stopped being quite so what's the word? We stopped being provincial is a word, because other countries were taking such pride and have taken such pride, in the Louvre and other countries like Italy and England have all taken enormous pride, Germany, in their art. And we just went through this spell where we didn't, and where we misunderstood the value of the arts and that the public should benefit, and that the arts weren't at all just for rich people, they were for all of us. Anyway, it's a good thing you could cut this and that you can edit this, and I hope you'll take out most of this because I get off on these tangents.
No, is that at the same time you mentioned earlier that poet laureate came into being?
Oh, yeah. That was later. That was just a bill we did, creating the poet laureate program, so to speak, in Oklahoma. Some other states have had that, so that we do have one at the national level and one in Oklahoma. And right now, as of this year, or this last fall, I guess, Governor Henry and the committee named N. Scott Momaday as our poet laureate, and it's very wonderful to have him. He was one of the, Angie DeBow would have been very proud to have seen him named our poet laureate.
That was done during your 24 years of service.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, I can't even remember all of the different individual things that we did. A lot of it just involved getting money for the arts and alternative education and little things like that. But
And the Jazz Hall of Fame.
Jazz Hall of Fame was one of my greatest bills, one of my favorite bills, and I shouldn't take much credit for that because that was strictly the strength of Maxine Horner, Senator Horner, and Don Ross from Tulsa, who was in the House. They were such ardent supporters, and that bill took less work than almost any other bill because they were such great advocates that we just passed it. I think it had very few votes against it. And now that has really a very robust history behind it in Tulsa. We have the Greenwood Cultural Center, Jazz Hall of Fame, and our commemorating our problematic past in that area as well as in the area of Native Americans.
Well, we're talking a little bit about art. We can switch gears into historical preservation. I mean, it was mentioned, but do you want to talk about?
Well, I think the main thing there was, and this really was not a state issue or act. The train station in Tulsa, for instance, which is now the Greenwood Cultural Center, that went through a lot of different phases. And so in that regard, I did get some money for some sculpture that's outside that train station, but that's the only thing I specifically did. The train station was preserved when it could have easily been torn down, as so much has been in Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did get some incentives for historic preservation and environmental preservation. We got a conservation easement bill passed, and that had as much to do with history as it did with the environment. But we did also, we have a historical society in Tulsa that's much more related to the state than it used to be. And we were able, to get some appropriations to help exhibits travel to Tulsa and other parts of the state. So there was some of that. But I think that historic preservation and the arts and cultural development more generally really relate to economic development and our well-being as a state. When we hold ourselves out to other states and try to get people to bring their companies here so we can improve our own quality of life, they really want to know about these things for their employees. Oh, the employees they'll hire, do you have a ballet? Do you have a symphony, an opera? I mean, it's amazing how much they care about cultural amenities. There are issues that were said to be important to them that seem to actually matter much less. Right to work was one of those wedge issues that really was not as much a factor as business magazines sometimes made it out to be. The education system and what we were doing for education and the possibilities within education we were allowing for, so that children of employees would have choices. That was much more important. Until you got to maybe a certain level, I don't strike that. Mm-hmm. It was important to have targeted opportunities, tax credits, and incentive funds and tax increment finance, some things like that. Also, not just cultural development, but some innovative ways of appealing to companies within the state to grow and to attract companies from outside the state. So, especially in science and technology. So that was something else Robert Henry and I worked on. And to make Oklahoma not just a magnet for other people out of state, but to build ourselves up and invest in ourselves. I do think our problematic past has created this kind of pessimism about whether we can really rise above this. So every now and then you see leadership that is able to transcend our limitations, our feelings that hold us back.
That comes into the science and mathematics school.
Absolutely. And it was part of the notion of creating a model like the Quartz Mountain Summer Institute. I mean, if you say, look, here's what we mean by really great arts education. Come down to Quartz Mountain, you can see it and see what these students are doing 2 weeks out of the year. They've gone through a very competitive process to get here. Nationally known people are brought in or tapped, like in Oklahoma, to teach these students. And we said the same thing for the School of Math and Science. It's a shame to let students languish, especially in rural Oklahoma, where the high schools just couldn't afford to give the advanced courses or even calculus. But the advanced math courses, that would help these students get into MIT and Harvard and the top flight universities there where they really were destined to go if they could just get the right preparation to be ready for those places. So we created the school as a magnet to enable students from Blue Jacket and all these little places to come, as it turned out, to Oklahoma City, as it turned out to be, because there was a competition for where we would have the school. Stillwater was it was really one of the finalists. But we finally decided that Oklahoma City was most appropriate because it was our state capital. And at that time, we had the local media, the local newspaper, Daily Oklahoman, had not been for putting more money in education. And eventually they did really come to support this school. And I do think it helped because when you create a model of what real college preparation should look like, not just a place to develop the brightest students, but a place that showed what coursework looks like if you want to be able to go to college and be ready for college. This is what it looks like. This is what you have to do. This is how hard you have to work. And so we were able to physically show, so at least subliminally, I think the Daily Oklahoman became much more supportive of education in years thereafter. So I'm glad we put it in Oklahoma City.
Oh, more centrally located too.
It is. It's more central. It's the state capital. Symbolically, it was important. It's just across the street from the Health Sciences Center. So at least for the medically related science and math fields, you had this terrific opportunity for students to work across the street or for their researchers and scientists to come give some time at the school, do a little mentoring, advising. So it's worked out to be great. But OSU has been a very important participant in it as well. A lot of the graduates go to OSU. So it's a good relationship with the two comprehensive universities. It was a fight though. I was one of the two votes, the head of the board and I. Oh my God. It was just a big fight about who was going to get this school, because little by little, even though it was not popular initially, seen as another of those little elitist ideas, it became popular. It gradually, see, it took years. You can't do this sort of thing with term limits.
I was going to say, how long would it take to do this?
It did. It took, maybe 10 years to get it really started from the time we did the legislation. So when you have a term limit that 10 or 12 years, you just can't get it done. But little by little, we just worked on it, and we were investing, I hate to say, lots of money in various aspects of special education. We had and have a school for the deaf, school for the blind, and that was one of the side considerations. People started thinking, we do make some targeted investments in models and one-of-a-kind schools, and maybe there is a need to have this too, so people who just go off the charts in IQ from small towns in Oklahoma can get these opportunities being with these great faculty people here. So it was great. I'm so glad we did that. A lot of this we did in my early years in the legislature when Robert Henry was there, and then he left. And I got some bills done in between, but there's nothing like being a freshman and not knowing better. Just being able to really get some things done because you think they're possible. And of course we should have this level of excellence. So I missed that opportunity, that challenge.
So you mentioned term limits a little earlier. Do you have any comments on that?
Oh, I'm not for them. I think that people have the right to not reelect someone.
Right, they vote you out.
It's I think I can understand them better for the executive branch if you're president or governor. Then you're in charge of the whole bureaucracy. And our system of government is built on balance of power. And so if you just had, when Roosevelt had 4 terms, people said, wait a minute, this is getting out of hand. We do need to have some checks and balances in the federal government, and eventually most states decided they needed them too. But with congresspeople and legislators who have to go back and talk to their people every 2 years usually, those voters can limit your terms. So I think it's one of the few fronts it's the only issue I can think of that I would agree with the John Birch and very conservative people on, John Birch Society, that this is a right to vote that should not be taken away from people.
Any chance they'll reverse it?
I doubt it. I doubt it. But as I said earlier, I don't think people value themselves enough. That they should have the right to vote. But voters in the past took away that right from themselves with majority vote. And I just don't see it being reversed.
But you spent more time in the Senate than you did in the House.
Yeah.
Is there that much of a difference between the two?
Yeah. It's a lot more hurly-burly in the House, and it's very cozy because you share a desk with someone. So you're sitting there with your seatmate, and you're all crowded, and there's lots of discussion and activity, and it can be so unruly that you sometimes have to have stricter rules than we do in the Senate. In the Senate, everybody has their own desk, and they, talk on and on. Very rarely does debate get limited. It's just a very different place. So you're given a kind of respect or accord in the Senate that you're not in the House, but you're also subject to the other chamber. I mean, in the Senate, we didn't initiate the things that the House did. So in the days when the legislature was empowered to raise taxes like every other state, which we are not now, the House by law had to initiate any revenue raising measure. And then we, the Senate, would either go along with it or we wouldn't. And then the governor would sign it or he wouldn't. The Senate, because of that, I think didn't initiate legislation as much as the House did. It wasn't as creative. More a deliberative body, but didn't initiate and wasn't as innovative. It was more reform-minded on some fronts, but then on others, you know, the Senate had their domains and they had the advice and consent and approval of appointees, kinds of privileges that they didn't want to give up. You know, they just atmospherically, they were two different places. But I really love the challenge of both. I get very frustrated, but I get frustrated with myself as much as I would with them. Oh, I can't do better. Why can't I communicate better? That's what I think. We've lost some of these people from the legislature who were such great communicators, who could convince us to do things we didn't want to do, even though we knew for the common weal, for the best of all, it was important to do them. And it's so easy, just to say one last thing on policy level. It's so easy to be tough on people physically and do violence and have, you know, corporal punishment we've had. And we've been one of these states that's understood violence very well. I mean, and we've in some ways succeeded as a state, either in spite of it, certainly not because of it, but we've grown up with that kind of orientation. I mean, cockfighting became an odd issue. Just odd. We were, I guess, one of the last two states to do away with it. But it's so hard to, for lack of a better word, make peace for safety. If you're not funding, if you're not investing in your own people, young people, and they're out committing crimes and causing trouble of one sort or another, it's just going to get worse. And so if you're not helping to turn them around and get them to a point in their lives where they see a more positive future for themselves, just locking them up and doing all the things we do to punish them is not only not going to get them there, it's going to make things worse. And now we have the research to show that. That it's going to be unsafe for the rest of us. It's less safe when you lock up all these kids and all these people. So, I'm sorry. I got off on this tangent. You had asked me a different question.
You're doing fine.
It's tough love works better than just locking people up and throwing away the key, as they say.
And there's a large number of women in prison.
We're number one in the world, not just the United States, in the world. We are.
Oklahoma is.
Mm-hmm. And it's not because our women are any better than they are elsewhere. Just that's something, it's just a natural thing that we do. When a lot of our crimes are drug related, and women happen to drive a car that's related to a drug run of some kind, or oftentimes she's doing it for domestic reasons. But they're the ones who are locked up. And the statistics show that men, for whatever reason, have plea bargained away their jail time in instances where women have not. I mean, it's just something that needs further looking into. Why that is. Was it that they didn't have the right legal representation? I don't know. So there are lots of problems that we have that are ongoing. A lot of people down there in Oklahoma City are really believe in solving problems and want to work on problems. Some have become too partisan, where a lot of this has become too partisan again, where we don't even want a solution for something because it'll make someone look good. You know, excuse me? It's, I see that in Congress even more than I see it in Oklahoma, but I could see it start happening here. I would say after Henry Bellman was governor, I started seeing it more. Not during his time at all, but after that.
So how many different governors did you serve under then?
I would say
24 years.
5. And so now that I think of it, that was under Governor Frank Keating's time, and I think that he had been a very good senator, in my opinion, when he was in the state senate. But that larger thinking had gotten a hold of him in the Republican Party, and so he was really, it seemed to me, doing more the bidding of this larger thinking in the Republican Party about taking over, and the way to take over was to have wedge issues and get really partisan and take over the legislature. And so we could see, as the years wore on in Oklahoma, it was becoming less Democrat and more Republican, especially in Congress, but also at the state level. Because when that's your goal and your energies are devoted to that, you can be effective at it. And they were. I, as a Democrat, say that they were. But if you're thinking longer term about your state, that total partisan polarization really doesn't help. I don't think. Some of the old debate worked, but we were always able to build coalitions with Republicans and Democrats in Oklahoma in the past, and now it looks very tough.
Yes, it does.
I don't know how they do it in the Senate, co-operated by the two parties.
It's been interesting, I think.
I do think we saw in Washington that it was quite problematic to have one party in charge of both the executive and the congressional, the legislative branches of government, because no one put on the brakes. The Democrats didn't. When the Democrats were in the minority, you know, they certainly weren't going to be for cutting things they cared about more. And when Republicans and George Bush just put more money, all of that surplus was squandered, my opinion. So I just hate what's happened to Washington. And it's time for a good debate. And we're having one. We're in the middle of one now.
So will let me run for Congress next?
Nope.
Nope.
No. I'm not sure yet what I'll do. But
We have the silver hair legislators.
yes, they have that. But I'm not going to do that. I'm not sure what I'll do yet. I have now this luxury of time when I can decide. But it'll be something related to poverty in the arts and education.
Write a book.
Maybe.
Before we end, I just want to ask you about your memories of the bombing, the Memorial Building bombing. Do you remember
The what?
the bombing in Oklahoma City?
Oh, yes. April 19th.
Mm-hmm. You would have been in the Senate. Then.
I was in the Senate. And but we lived downtown. We had an apartment. Downtown, just a few blocks from the Memorial Building. And my apartment mate was there when it happened, and it knocked her off the chair. I mean, there was such an impact. I was not far away at the state capitol, and we could feel the building tremble after we heard this loud crack. There was just a crack, and then this you could feel the impact of the crack. And then we found out later that that's what it was. So we're very close to that. That was a real shocker. That was quite a trauma we all went through. Were you here?
No, we got moved here yet. It's the year before we came.
And the whole trial time we lived through, you think of all of that, and what a foretaste that gave us of having the 9/11 occur in New York. It just brought all of us right, snapped us right to attention the minute we realized what was happening. It wasn't totally deja vu, but we felt that impact before. And it did have it did bring us together as a people at the time. Everyone wanted to help, and there was none of this partisan division then. But then pretty soon thereafter, the next year or so, things started getting just very bitter and pointed and divisive. And I'm just, it may take conflict and argument to get things done, but at least then something gets done. You don't just stay in the place you were. And now, when I left the legislature, I didn't have the feeling we were getting on down the road. I had the feeling we were kind of stalemated.
What could that be, because of term limits a little? Maybe, or not so much?
Possibly. I think a lot of what we did was not put our names on bills and pass legislation. Those of us who, I will say, who really cared about the progress of our state, a lot of what we did was put out fires to stop really bad legislation from happening. And I think I like to flatter ourselves as a class, because I was in that first class that was forced to leave the legislature. that first class of senators and representatives. And I like to think, had we been there, we would not have let this 1804, this anti-immigrant bill pass. I think it's been very detrimental, and it's just caused a lot of problems, and it didn't solve any. I don't see that. It's just it's ended up being an anti-immigrant bill instead of an anti-illegal immigrant bill. It swept up all the people who are undocumented, who are not citizens even though they grew up here from age 3 months and went to school here and paid taxes here and did everything. They were brought here by their parents and for one reason or another haven't been able to get citizenship or didn't even try. But a lot of these people are just undocumented. They're not illegal. They themselves did nothing to come here illegally. But there's no distinction, it seems to me, between those two. And then the legal immigrants of similar nationalities get lumped in too. And so it just created this climate of suspicion, hatred. And I like to think, and it's really affected us economically too, companies have told us. And it's been challenged by the National Chamber of Commerce. There's a legal challenge pending to this bill. But at any rate, I just think it's if we had talked more about what the real problems are and how we could really focus on those and solve the real problems instead of smearing everyone with this broad brush and making us seem what we are not. We are not an inhospitable state. Of all the states I can think of, we have the most variety because of our Native American population. The most richness of variety, the greatest richness of variety. And we are not an inhospitable state, but now people elsewhere think we are. So this legislation's really put us on the map. In the worst way.
None of those consult with the ones that had to exit.
That's right. And about 20% of them have. I mean, we have really lost a lot of people. And it's not what we needed to do. We haven't been much of a growing state anyway. We need more, especially more bright young people growing up in this state. Anyway, I just hated to see it. I wanted to think of one positive thing I could think of to end on it. It gets back to the focus of being in this room with Angie DeBow. And it's not something that was directly connected with her, but it is, I think of this song, Oklahoma, and it is a positive rendition of what is the best in our grain, what's really good in our grain. And I think you brought up the bombing in Oklahoma City. So much good came out in people after that, both at the individual level and even at the political level, where we forgot some of our fights and banded together, gave blood, helped here in Oklahoma City. I hope that song forecasts our future more than some of the things that have happened lately. I'm sorry about those. I'm sorry not to be a part of the fight about those issues. I miss that. I miss working with great people and some of our wonderful staff experts. I miss them and their expertise, and talking about the public good, what's best for us and the future generations. I miss all of that. And so that's just an admission. But I have sure luxuriated in some of the things about the state that I love, just as a everyday citizen, just spending time going to arts events and movies and grandmothering and doing things that I love to do. I feel like you deserve this good life. And one of these days I'll get back to work.
No, 24 years, you did a lot of work.
It was a real privilege. And the one last thing I wanted to say, thinking of Oklahoma, was even more broadly of thinking of music. My friend Don McCorkle, who was in the house with me, used to look out at us doing all these bills and describe his notion of the legislature as the jazz band theory of politics. And, everyone had a little different instrument, and they were making great music. And most of us couldn't play the piano and the trumpet both, and we understood each other's weaknesses and foibles. But we worked with each other to bring about some really great things. Some nursing home reform of the juvenile code, just a lot of good legislation in the early childhood opportunities in Oklahoma, making that a universal opportunity. So all were one of the few things we're number one in is the early childhood programs, because all children, all 4-year-olds, are eligible if their parents want them to go to those programs. That kind of thing. I think the jazz band theory of politics brought about a lot of wonderful things. And this being part of that jazz band, I'm a better collaborator than I am a loner. I mean, I like that, doing something to make our place better. And I'm sure a lot of us feel that way.